The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And it's a pleasure for me to rise today in this debate on C7 and be the first speaker on behalf of Her Majesty's loyal opposition on this important subject. I think, Madam Speaker, that all parties in this place respect the important role played by the RCMP, the GRC, our Mounties, not just for their iconic image they represent around the world and the subsequent acknowledgement of Canadians as a people that respect one another and enjoy peace, order, and good government. But we acknowledge, and we've paid homage in this House, when some of our frontline men and women have risked their lives and, in fact, given their lives in recent years in Alberta, in Moncton, serving Canada and protecting the society we all enjoy. And certainly while the Conservative Party, when we were in government, we followed the court case of the Mounted Police Association of Ontario very closely as it made its way through the courts. And, Madam Speaker, we're here today because of a decision of the Supreme Court of Canada that came down last year and provided an opportunity for the government to respond. The previous government had been looking at the Supreme Court decision, consulting, meeting with senior leadership within the RCMP, hearing from frontline members. Then there was the transition, Madam Speaker, and now this same issue was faced by the new Liberal government, who asked for a little bit of an extension in January, and the court has given the government until April to come up with a framework for labour relations, for bargaining for members of the RCMP that meet the spirit and intent of the Supreme Court decision in the Mounted Police Association of Ontario versus Canada. But I'm here today, Madam Speaker, as the official opposition public safety critic, and I'll be speaking just before or alongside my colleague who's responsible for Treasury Board, because certainly the impact of that Supreme Court decision has a dual aspect. It certainly solidifies and really elucidates the right to collective bargaining that the Supreme Court has given members of the RCMP, and their exclusion from this Public Sector Labour Relations Act was declared unconstitutional and in violation of Section 2D of the Charter, the right to association, Madam Speaker. But there certainly will be economic ramifications of that as well. So that's the second aspect of the decision, and why the opposition will lead off with both public safety and Treasury Board speaking. But as the public safety critic, and having heard from Commissioner Paulson just yesterday and had the opportunity to have him before the Public Safety Committee already in this new Parliament, Madam Speaker, I want to begin my remarks really by thanking the frontline men and women of our RCMP. They are charged with a very important role in our country, given the breadth and size of our country and the fact that there's large portions of rural Canada that would not have policing services were it not for the men and women of the RCMP, Madam Speaker. So this subject, while it deals with labour relations and ultimately impacts on the fiscal framework for Canada, we must begin the conversation by acknowledging, certainly on all sides of this House, the tremendous respect we have for the RCMP. 28,461 regular force members of the RCMP, not including auxiliaries, which we all know and see in communities across the country, also play a very critical role, particularly for large events and things like that in our communities across the country. And let's put that in perspective for a moment, Madam Speaker. That 28,000 or so members of Canada's police force is significant when you compare it to the next largest police force in Canada, the Ontario Provincial Police, with about 6,100 uniformed members, Madam Speaker, and certainly the largest municipal police service, also in Ontario, with the Toronto Police Service, Madam Speaker, with 7,900 members. So the Supreme Court, and really the court case launched by the Association in Ontario, recognized that alongside their municipal comrades in arms, their provincial comrades, Canada's largest police force needed the ability to have effective collective bargaining in the same way that their provincial and municipal cousins did, Madam Speaker. And that is what the Supreme Court has given some guidance on, and that's what's led us here to C7 today. But I will note that Canada's largest police force, our national police force, does attract a significant expense of the Government of Canada for salaries, about a $1.6 billion commitment to public safety, to frontline policing across the country, Madam Speaker. All parties acknowledge, and only time will tell, but all parties acknowledge that the impact of this Supreme Court decision and the changing of the bargaining arrangement, or the unionization, if you want to call it in more simple terms, of the RCMP, will have a significant impact on the fiscal framework for Canada, Madam Speaker. I say that mere hours before the budget to be brought forward by the new government. I'm hoping that they approach C7 and its implementation with a little more caution than it appears that they've been approaching this budget, Madam Speaker, particularly when it comes to operational spending, most of which is made up of salaries. The pressures on that, particularly once referenced bargaining between the large municipal and provincial forces in Canada, we need to make sure our front line get what they deserve, get the support they deserve, the salary, remuneration, benefits, also health care and support for mental health. So we need to make sure that we look at the well-being of our frontline officers, not just in the context of salaries, but in terms of how we take care of them both before, while they're serving, and after, particularly if they leave with a service-related injury. I will say for a brief moment, Madam Speaker, that in my brief, far too brief time, unfortunately, as Minister of Veterans Affairs, I had the honour of interacting quite regularly with the RCMP and its members because, as the government knows and as the new minister well knows, the ill and injured of the RCMP are provided for, and their support is administered through Veterans Affairs Canada. So we've certainly seen how in recent years the health and wellness support, particularly for mental injuries from service, have dramatically come into the modern era, and we're very proud of that. I know the new government is going to continue that important work. Our Public Safety Committee right now is studying operational stress injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder for our frontline responders. The interesting thing with Veterans Affairs, the learnings over the last generation from our veterans and from our Canadian Armed Forces is now being shared with our RCMP and with municipal police forces and provincial police forces. In fact, the Canadian Armed Forces Road to Mental Readiness document, a wellness document for mental health, is now really the touchstone, Madam Speaker, for first responder uniformed personnel serving Canada. So I think that needs to be a very important part of this discussion, but also the implementation of what comes from C7. I also need, as the Member of Parliament for Durham, to once again thank the men and women of RCMP Detachment Bowmanville in my community, Madam Speaker, who are part of the Toronto East, the O Detachment of the RCMP, which is not as widely seen in Ontario because we have the OPP, but this detachment for the Toronto GTA East is very important. And like so many communities, Madam Speaker, when the men and women hang up their uniform after their shift, these same people are often the coaches at the hockey rink and the soccer fields and become the backbone of our community. So I want to salute the RCMP members in my own detachment, Madam Speaker, and speak for a minute about the 8 provinces. Quebec and Ontario have provincial police forces, but in many parts of this country, as I said at the outset, rural parts of Canada would not have that important underpinning of public safety were it not for the men and women of the RCMP, particularly rural areas where often that member will be the first and solo response to an incident, and in recent years their ability to work with parts of rural Canada, First Nations leaderships and First Nations police forces has truly been remarkable, Madam Speaker, and that needs to be also part of the framework that becomes the new collective bargaining approach for our RCMP. So, as I said, we are here. C7 is the result of the government's response to the Supreme Court of Canada decision in the Mounted Police Association of Ontario case versus Canada. And specifically what that looked at was, did the Staff Relations Representative Program within the RCMP meet the test of giving the freedom of association to members of the RCMP guaranteed by the Charter? Certainly, I think all sides understand, and one of our members of our caucus who's a proud retired RCMP officer knows that this Staff Relations Representative Program did try and act as that conduit between the workforce and management in the sense of a bargaining agent, Madam Speaker. And because of the creation of that Staff Relations Program going back to the 1970s, Madam Speaker, for that reason, the RCMP was excluded from the Public Sector Labour Relations Act, specifically excluded in legislation. And that exclusion, alongside an analysis of the Staff Representative Program, is what ultimately the Supreme Court looked at. And their finding was that this Staff Relations Program did not meet the standard they expected under the Charter, under Section 2D, providing the men and women of the RCMP with the freedom of association. It's interesting, the decision did not say just strike out those sections of the PSLRA, the Public Safety Labour Relations Act, and treat the RCMP like any other public service. The Supreme Court did not say that, Madam Speaker, and that's important to note. And in fact, the analysis of the Supreme Court is quite illustrative, particularly with our modern labour law, which is starting to move away from the traditional Wagner model that we inherited from 1930s labour relations in the United States, Madam Speaker. So what did the Court actually say in this decision? And we see parts of that reflected in C7, and we will say that as the opposition, and then we have concerns of another nature. The Court said that Section 2D guarantees meaningful collective bargaining, meaningful representation. But they broke that down further, Madam Speaker, and said that meaningful collective bargaining and that meaningful representation has two parts to it. The first part is employee choice. There must be choice. And the second part, to provide that meaningful standard, there needs to be sufficient independence from management. And this is really where the old model within the RCMP failed in the eyes of the Court, was that the Staff Relations Program was not seen to be independent enough from management. It was seen more as a human resources tool and not an agent for bargaining and protecting the collective rights of the employees. So that's an important distinction to make, Madam Speaker, because had the Staff Relations Program been a little more independent, this may have survived the Supreme Court's analysis. The Supreme Court specifically said, and I'll quote, "The freedom of association under Section 2D of the Charter is a guarantee that will not necessarily protect all of association activity, but that the arrangement must not substantially interfere," that was a later quote they used, and that's the new standard, "with the employees' rights to that bargaining, their choice and the independence." So C7 does reflect that and brings certain parts of the workplace relationship outside of C7. So I respect the fact that government has acknowledged that part of the decision. So certain elements through the grievance process and certain elements of the workplace will not be subject to the collective bargaining relationship, Madam Speaker. And I think that's important, given the very unique role and the chain of command structure and heritage of the RCMP as a police force. So that the government appears to acknowledge that in C7. But what is absent entirely from C7, Madam Speaker, is that first element of the Supreme Court's decision. Meaningful collective bargaining and the meaningful right to association under the Charter must have as its first principle employee choice. And in fact, I heard my friend from Spadina, Fort York earlier talk about the frontline members of the RCMP and say, if they choose, if they choose. Well, that's what the Supreme Court of Canada put as the fundamental construct to this relationship, employee choice. But what's absent in C7 is a codification of that employee choice, which in our modern democracy requires a secret ballot vote, Madam Speaker. So the members of the RCMP, whose collective right under Section 2D of the Charter can be exercised by their employee choice at the first instance, saying whether they want an association or not, and that vote to be conducted in a way that conforms with our democratic principles should be by secret ballot. Why that's interesting, Madam Speaker? Because on the order paper we have two bills before Parliament. We're in the early days, so leaving out private members' business, I think we're up to C7 or 8. C4 expresses the government's clear intention that secret ballot should not be a fundamental underpinning of the choice employees have on whether to belong to a union or not. So I have not heard the parliamentary secretary, my friend in his remarks, explain that omission, but I hope to hear that addressed somewhere in the debate on C7, because it does drive an interesting omission on the part of the government. The Supreme Court of Canada said the first pillar to meaningful right of association is employee choice, but that's not codified in C7 itself. So I think you will see, Madam Speaker, the opposition learning from the Supreme Court, making sure that employee choice and secret ballot is directly a part of C7. And we hope, with the government being mindful of the court decision, they will agree to amend the bill to reflect that. And if they do, it's our intention to work with them on it, Madam Speaker. The previous government, as I said, was looking at the impact of this Supreme Court decision and how we could guarantee this charter right for our men and women of the RCMP, alongside making sure their important structure, chain of command, and the important duties and risks inherent in policing are respected and not diminished, and public safety is not impacted through the course of what might be regular Wagner model union construct, Madam Speaker. What's interesting is this decision, along with the Fraser Health decision, has shown a gradual departure in labour law from the traditional Canadian law, Madam Speaker. In fact, if you look at when Justice Rosie Abella was on the Ontario Labour Relations Board, years ago, there was a balance between these boards, these arbitration-type boards, quasi-judicial bodies, the law, and the legislature. But now that legislatures are intervening more in labour law, and now that this charter right is developing with respect to association, it's changing the old model. And the courts have acknowledged that. In fact, some of the best labour minds in the country, including some friends of mine that I used to practice law with, including Brian Burkett and John Craig, have written on the move away from the Wagner model. So what does that mean? That means the exclusivity of a union guaranteed by the Wagner model may indeed be a thing of the past, and that it's quite acceptable for provisions of what the police do to be excluded from collective bargaining. In fact, the court has said the Wagner model itself is not the constitutional right. It is that meaningful right to collective bargaining and an agent that's constitutionally protected. And as I remind you, Madam Speaker, as I said, that fundamental charter right, which led to this decision, the two-part test, the first part is employee choice. So the government should have that reflected in C7, employee choice on who their agent should be, on their priorities, but also employee choice on whether they're unionized. And that should be by secret ballot, which Canada has had since 1874. So if the government acknowledges and amends, they may see some unanimity in this place, and I'd like to see that, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the comments of the member from Durham and all the work that he does. On behalf of the RCMP and the Canadian Armed Forces, but his comments confused me. He's insisting on a secret ballot. C-525, which his government brought forward, actually makes it more difficult for employees to unionize, harder for unions to certify, and easier for unions to be decertified. And so that is the bill that our government is repealing with C4, in which case the board will have a choice it will be at the discretion of the board whether there will be a secret ballot or whether there would be a card check, and the board can make sure that the members' interests are being reflected in the choice made. And so why would the secret ballot, which makes it harder for the collective bargaining process, less freedom for the members, why is the member insisting on that as the mechanism?
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In fact, I'm suggesting to this House, through you, Madam Speaker, to my colleague, that's what the Supreme Court has required. With employee choice being the most fundamental element of this charter right, the true way to have employee choice with respect to unionization and with respect to the bargaining unit itself is the secret ballot. I keep finding myself referencing Liberal leaders in this House, Madam Speaker, usually to show how this new Liberal government is quite different from its past. We've had the secret ballot in Canada since Alexander Mackenzie, a very little-known Prime Minister, a Liberal Prime Minister in 1874. This has been a fundamental tenet of our parliamentary democracy. And in fact, Madam Speaker, my friend who asked this question was at the briefing with her officials yesterday, where one of the senior officials said literally every certification vote in the public service has been by secret ballot. So now that we've had that established and it's a fundamental tenet, let's have it reflected in C7. And as I said, Madam Speaker, if we see that, if they support our amendment on this, you may see this bill pass speedily through the House, particularly with the court deadline of April. I'd like to see that, so I'd like to see the government move. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, prior to being elected, I was fortunate enough to work for a major union in this country for 16 years, and I represented many workers before the Canada Industrial Relations Board who sought certification under federal legislation. And the legislation that I worked under always gave the Canada Industrial Relations Board the discretion to order a vote in any certification application where they felt it was necessary. That was the law. That's always been the case. Their practice was to permit certification when they were presented with evidence from employees that a majority of them wanted to unionize. And what I found, and I spent many, many days battling at the CIRB, was when employers found out about a certification drive, many of them would interfere with their members' constitutional rights, fire employees, discipline employees, intimidate employees. And it's the automatic certification that is intended to stop employers from affecting that constitutional right. And that's why card checks, where members have the ability to indicate their desires, submit that to the board, is actually the best way to test the will of a majority of employees and to minimize employer interference. I'm wondering if my honourable colleague has anything to say about the employers in this country who have violated employees' rights to certify by firing and disciplining them. And he just has to go to the Labour Board. He can read hundreds and thousands of cases of that happening.
Member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my friend. He is my friend. I know he's passionate about the subject. But it concerns me greatly that he would suggest the Government of Canada would act untoward against some of its own people. I'm sure he can pluck a few Labour Relations Board decisions of an employer, trying to resist unionization. We're talking the government, Madam Speaker. In fact, that's why his colleague was at this briefing. That's why the official said the normal course for certification in the public realm is by secret ballot. What I find interesting, and as a labor lawyer himself, he should look at, these decisions have shown that the old model is wearing out, the Wagner model. So the very fact that exclusivity for a union is now at risk. And what's nice about C7 is the government recognized the unique nature of the RCMP, so the traditional public sector unions cannot just move in and try and unionize this workforce. It has to be a unique bargaining agent looking at the needs of the workforce. And that's where labor law is going, actually looking at the unique needs of the workplace, the unique needs of the people at the front lines. So we respect this. C7 has tried to get that balance right. It's one major omission, Madam Speaker, is the secret ballot right that most public sector employees have enjoyed, which the Supreme Court has indicated is fundamental. So I truly hope the government realizes its oversight in C7, moves towards it, and then I think we can have something important to our men and women in uniform move quickly through this place. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And during my colleague's speech, he alluded very briefly to the impact that this might have in terms of the fiscal framework, and I think that is something that is important to look at. And I also need to bring it to today in relationship to the budget we anticipate at 4 o'clock, where, you know, I think the fiscal framework, with the all indications being there's going to be many sort of wants, not needs in this budget, to talk about that issue in terms of the space that this government is going to leave in the fiscal framework for what ultimately will be not a want, but will be certainly a need in terms of what the government is compelled to do.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my friend from Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou, for her interventions. They're always, you know, very on mark in this place, and for her support for our men and women in uniform, the Canadian Armed Forces, the RCMP, and our veterans, Madam Speaker. She did indeed reference that today is Budget Day. I did a poll yesterday. It's now going to be known as Red Tuesday, Madam Speaker, because the red team is taking us into the red in a dramatic fashion. And that has to be in the background of C7, Madam Speaker, because any analysis will show that this will put more pressure on the framework in the range of tens, if not into hundreds of millions of dollars potentially per year, Madam Speaker. So what I think is we need to get this right by providing employee choice first. But as I said in my remarks, this looking at the unique needs of policing, and the court has said the unique needs of a workplace must be reflected in its bargaining agent, we should be looking at health care, mental health support, a whole range of service conditions and issues apart from just the salary piece, given the unique role of the RCMP, but given some of the impacts on our men and women from their frontline service. So I really hope that the government recognizes its omission of true employee choice in C7 and makes that fix, and that they work and the minister works alongside the commissioner of the RCMP to make sure that bargaining and the well-being of our people is not just salary negotiations, but a look at making sure wellness in uniform and afterwards is safeguarded.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je salue les hommages faits à la GRC par mon honorable collègue. Je regrette que la discussion tende à confondre un certain nombre de choses, alors que l'exercice était absolument de rétablir une déficience, si on veut, une erreur, une correction à apporter pour permettre aux membres d'avoir une négociation de plein droit. Et je ne crois pas, et là je m'en remets à la connaissance légale, à la sagesse légale de mon collègue, sur le fait que la Cour suprême, à mon avis, n'intervient pas sur le processus par lequel on va y arriver, mais sur le droit d'avoir accès à ce genre de représentation. Alors, est-ce que j'étais ravi d'entendre dans son discours qu'il félicitait le comité sur la sécurité d'adresser la question sur la PTSD, le stress post-traumatique? Est-ce que, par exemple, le comité serait le meilleur moyen d'adresser ce genre de détails?
The honourable member for Durham has 25 seconds to answer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for his intervention. We're both missing committee because of this debate, so I'm sure we will both scurry over there shortly after. I think he's right. C7 is the government's response, and I rose to say in January they were taking more time to correct a flaw. But I'll say again, the court's first fundamental tenet of the charter right is employee choice, and that's not reflected in this bill. What is catching the government in an awkward position is that C4, which was an election promise for Labour support in the election, conflicts with C7 and what the charter expects. So they're going to have to reconcile that before the House, Madam Speaker.